I raised my son Marcus for 28 years as a single mother, working double shifts and sacrificing everything I had to give him the best life possible. I never missed a soccer game, helped him through college, and even co-signed his first apartment lease when his credit wasn't good enough. But when he announced his engagement to Jessica, everything changed. What started as the happiest news of my life quickly became the most painful betrayal I'd ever experienced. And when he finally banned me from his own wedding, he had no idea that my surprise guest would turn his perfect day into the most unforgettable disaster of his life. Let me start from the beginning, because the story of how I lost my son and then got him back is more complicated than you might think. Marcus was born during one of the worst storms our city had seen in decades. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, and completely alone, except for the nurses who held my hand through 12 hours of labor. His father, David, had walked out 3 months earlier when I told him I was pregnant. He said he wasn't ready for the responsibility and needed to find himself. I never heard from him again, not even when Marcus was born. Those early years were the hardest of my life. I was working as a waitress at a 24-hour diner, taking night shifts so I could be home with Marcus during the day. I'd get maybe 4 hours of sleep between my shift ending at 6 a.m. and Marcus waking up. My mother helped when she could, but she was dealing with her own health problems and couldn't take on the full-time childcare I desperately needed. Money was always tight. I remember counting coins to buy diapers and choosing between groceries and gas for my beat-up Honda Civic. There were nights when I'd feed Marcus his bottle and then eat nothing but crackers for dinner because that's all we had left. I applied for government assistance, but the paperwork was overwhelming, and I was too proud to admit how desperately I needed help. When Marcus was 3, I made the decision that changed our lives. I enrolled in nursing school at the community college, taking classes during the day while he was in daycare and working at the diner at night. It meant even less sleep and more stress, but I knew I needed a career that could actually support us both. The nursing program was intense, requiring clinical rotations at the hospital and countless hours of studying that I had to squeeze in between work and parenting. I'll never forget the night Marcus got sick with pneumonia when he was 7. I'd been working a double shift and came home to find him burning up with fever, barely able to breathe. I rushed him to the emergency room where I worked, and the doctor said if I'd waited even a few more hours, we could have lost him. I sat by his hospital bed for 3 days straight, missing work and classes, but nothing else mattered except making sure my baby was okay. Those were the moments that defined our relationship. It was always just the two of us against the world. I taught him to tie his shoes, helped him with his homework, cheered at every little league game even when I was exhausted from working all night. Marcus was my entire world, and I thought I was his too. He was such a sweet kid, always telling me he loved me and promising that when he grew up, he'd take care of me the way I'd taken care of him. The teenage years brought their own challenges. Marcus started asking questions about his father, wanting to know why other kids had dads, and he didn't. I told him that his father had died when he was little, which seemed kinder than explaining abandonment. Marcus accepted this explanation, but I could see how much the absence affected him. He gravitated toward male teachers and coaches, always seeking the approval and guidance that should have come from his father. Despite our financial struggles, Marcus excelled in school. He was smart, ambitious, and determined to make something of himself. I was so proud when he got accepted to the state university with a partial academic scholarship. I worked extra shifts and took out loans to cover the rest of his expenses, but seeing him walk across that graduation stage made every sacrifice worth it. After college, Marcus got a job at a marketing firm in the city. He was making good money and finally seemed to be living the successful life we'd both dreamed of. He moved into a nice apartment, bought decent clothes, and started talking about his career goals with a confidence I'd never seen before. For the first time since he was born, I felt like we'd made it through the hard times. That's when he met Jessica at some company networking event. She worked in public relations for a high-end boutique that catered to wealthy clients. From the first time Marcus mentioned her name, I could hear something different in his voice. He was infatuated in a way that worried me, talking about her like she was some exotic creature from a world he'd only dreamed of accessing. Our first meeting happened 6 months into their relationship. Marcus had been talking about Jessica constantly, describing her family's success and social connections with an admiration that made me uncomfortable. He seemed almost starstruck by her background, mentioning her father's corporate position and her mother's boutique as if they were celebrities he'd been lucky enough to meet. I spent the entire week before their visit cleaning my modest 2-bedroom house and planning the perfect menu. I wanted to make a good impression, to show Jessica that even though we didn't have money, we had love and warmth and family traditions worth respecting. I bought ingredients I couldn't really afford, and spent hours preparing Marcus's favorite dishes from his childhood. When Jessica walked through my front door that Sunday afternoon, I knew immediately that this was going to be a problem. She had that particular way of looking around that wealthy people sometimes have, not quite sneering, but clearly cataloging everything they considered beneath their standards. Her smile was polite but cold, and when I offered to take her designer coat, she declined, saying she preferred to keep it on despite the warm weather. During dinner, I watched Jessica pick at the pot roast I'd spent all day preparing. She kept checking her phone, which Marcus didn't seem to notice because he was too busy hanging on her every word. When I asked about her family, she answered in short, clipped sentences that made it clear she considered the conversation beneath her interest level. The real telling moment came when I mentioned my work at the county hospital. Jessica's expression shifted to something between disgust and pity, as if I just told her I cleaned sewers for a living. She actually asked if working with sick people wasn't depressing, making it sound like I'd chosen the most unpleasant possible career path. Marcus jumped in to explain how proud he was of my work, but Jessica had already moved on to discussing their upcoming vacation to some exclusive resort. As the evening progressed, Jessica's attitude became harder to ignore. When Marcus proudly showed her his old bedroom, which I kept exactly the same since he moved out, she made a comment about how quaint it was that I preserved his childhood like a museum. When I brought out photo albums of Marcus's achievements over the years, she flipped through them quickly, making polite noises but clearly bored by our family history. The conversation turned to their wedding plans, and that's when I learned they were considering a destination wedding in the Caribbean. Jessica described it as an intimate affair for close family only, but the way she emphasized close family while looking directly at me sent a chill down my spine. Marcus was too excited about the venue possibilities to notice the subtext, but I understood exactly what she was implying. When they finally left that evening, I felt emotionally drained in a way I hadn't experienced since Marcus's childhood illnesses. Something about Jessica's presence in my home had felt invasive and judgmental. I could see how much Marcus adored her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was going to be a problem for our close relationship. Over the following weeks, I tried everything I could think of to connect with Jessica. I called to invite her to lunch, suggesting we could get to know each other better without Marcus around to create pressure. She declined, claiming to be swamped with work projects. I offered to take her wedding dress shopping, thinking that might be something she'd enjoy sharing with her future mother-in-law. Again, she was too busy. I even suggested we plan her bridal shower together, offering to help with decorations, food, or whatever she needed. Jessica thanked me politely, but said she'd already arranged everything with her college friends and wouldn't want to impose on my time. Every rejection was delivered with perfect politeness, but the message was clear. She had no interest in including me in their wedding preparations. Marcus seemed oblivious to Jessica's cold treatment of me. When I gently mentioned that she seemed distant, he brushed off my concerns, saying she was just stressed about wedding planning and adjusting to the idea of gaining a mother-in-law. He assured me that once they were married and settled, Jessica would warm up to me. I wanted to believe him, but my instincts told me otherwise. The first real warning sign came when Marcus mentioned that Jessica's parents had offered to pay for the entire wedding. He said it casually, as if it was just a generous gesture from prospective in-laws, but I could hear the relief in his voice. The cost of a destination wedding was far beyond what we could afford, and Marcus had been stressing about how to pay for the kind of celebration Jessica wanted. What bothered me wasn't the financial assistance itself, but the way Marcus talked about Jessica's parents afterward. He began referring to them as if they were his own family, praising their generosity and success with an enthusiasm that felt like a betrayal of our own family history. He started dropping comments about their business connections and social circle, clearly impressed by a world of wealth and influence he'd never experienced. I began to notice changes in Marcus's behavior during our weekly phone calls. He talked less about his work and more about the social events he and Jessica attended. He mentioned dinner parties with Jessica's friends, charity galas, and networking events that seemed to revolve around people with money and status. His whole vocabulary began to shift, incorporating terms and references that felt foreign coming from the boy I'd raised. The most painful change was how Marcus began talking about our shared past. Stories that had once been sources of pride, like how hard we'd worked to pay for his education or how we'd overcome financial struggles together, were now mentioned with embarrassment. He'd joke about our humble beginnings in a way that suggested he was ashamed of where he'd come from. 2 months before the wedding, the conversation that changed everything happened. Marcus had been acting strange for weeks, canceling our usual dinners and seeming distracted during our phone calls. When he finally came to visit, I could see the nervousness in his body language before he even sat down. He was fidgeting with his keys, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in the careful tone he'd used as a child when he knew he was about to disappoint me. He started by talking about the wedding venue and how exclusive it was. The resort they'd chosen apparently had very strict limits on guest capacity, and every spot was precious. Jessica's family was large and included several important business associates who needed to be invited for professional reasons. The guest list had become a delicate balancing act of family obligations and social necessities. Then came the words that shattered my world. Marcus explained that after much consideration and difficult conversations with Jessica, they decided it would be best if I didn't attend the wedding. The venue was too small, the guest list too tight, and they felt it would be awkward having people there who didn't really fit in with the crowd they were expecting. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what my son had just told me. The child I'd raised alone, sacrificed everything for, put through college by working double shifts and taking out loans I was still paying off, was telling me I wasn't welcome at his wedding because I didn't fit in with his new social circle. When I finally found my voice, I asked him point blank if this was his decision or if Jessica had pressured him into excluding me. Marcus got defensive immediately, his face flushing red as he insisted it was a mutual choice made for practical reasons. He said I was being dramatic and trying to make him feel guilty for wanting to start fresh with his new family. That phrase, "start fresh with his new family," cut deeper than anything else he could have said. It meant that I was part of his old life, something to be left behind as he moved into a more sophisticated future. I asked him if he remembered who had sat up with him during childhood illnesses, who had worked nights to pay for his school supplies, who had been his biggest supporter through every challenge he'd faced. Marcus's response was even more hurtful than his original announcement. He accused me of trying to guilt trip him with emotional manipulation. He said I was being selfish and trying to ruin his happiness because I was jealous of Jessica's family's success. He actually suggested that my hurt feelings were about class envy rather than maternal love, as if wanting to attend my own son's wedding was somehow petty and small-minded. The conversation escalated into the worst fight we'd ever had. Marcus said things that revealed how much his perspective on our shared history had changed. He complained about growing up without a father, as if that had been my choice rather than his father's abandonment. He mentioned our financial struggles with resentment, forgetting that I worked myself to exhaustion to provide for him. Most painfully, he seemed to view my working-class background as something that had held him back rather than the foundation that had made his success possible. Before he left, Marcus tried to soften the blow by suggesting we could have a nice celebration dinner after he and Jessica returned from their honeymoon. He spoke to me like I was a distant relative who deserved a consolation prize rather than the woman who had given up everything to raise him. The casual cruelty of that suggestion, as if a makeup dinner could somehow compensate for missing his wedding, left me speechless with hurt and anger. That night, I cried harder than I had since the day his father walked out on us. The betrayal felt even worse because it was coming from someone I'd trusted completely. I'd always known that raising Marcus alone would be challenging, but I'd never imagined that success would make him ashamed of the woman who'd made it possible. The weeks that followed were torture. I kept hoping Marcus would call to apologize, that he'd realize how cruel he'd been and invite me to the wedding after all. Instead, I heard nothing from him directly. Through mutual friends and social media posts I couldn't help but check, I learned that wedding preparations were moving forward at full speed. Jessica had apparently hired some high-end wedding planner who specialized in destination events. The photos being posted showed elaborate floral arrangements, designer linens, and a level of luxury that was completely foreign to anything in Marcus's previous experience. The wedding was clearly being designed to impress Jessica's social circle rather than celebrate the actual marriage. What hurt most was discovering that Marcus had asked his former high school football coach to walk him down the aisle. This was a man he hadn't spoken to in years, someone who barely knew the adult Marcus had become. But apparently, having any male authority figure was preferable to acknowledging that his mother had been both parents to him for his entire life. I found out about this arrangement through my neighbor, whose son had played on the same team. She mentioned it casually, not realizing that I hadn't been told, and I had to excuse myself to cry in my kitchen. The idea that Marcus would give that honor to a virtual stranger rather than the parent who'd actually raised him felt like the ultimate rejection of everything I'd meant to him. The social isolation that followed was almost as painful as Marcus's betrayal itself. People in our small community had known Marcus since he was a baby, and word spreads fast in neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business. The questions started innocently enough, friends asking what I was wearing to the wedding, neighbors wondering if I needed help with travel arrangements. Having to explain over and over again that I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding was humiliating beyond description. Some people tried to be supportive, suggesting that Marcus would come to his senses or that there must be some misunderstanding. Others gave me pitying looks that made me feel even worse. A few seemed to assume I'd done something wrong to deserve such treatment, which made me question my own memories of our relationship. I began declining social invitations and avoiding places where I might run into people who would ask about the wedding. The grocery store, the post office, even church became minefields of potential embarrassment. I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter that announced my failure as a mother to anyone who knew our story. 3 weeks before the wedding, something inside me snapped. I was going through old boxes in my closet, looking for something to distract myself from the approaching date, when I found a business card that had been buried for years. It was from David, Marcus's father, from a company he'd started after disappearing from our lives. I'd completely forgotten that David had reached out about 5 years earlier, sending me that business card along with a letter attempting to explain his absence and express regret for abandoning us. At the time, I'd been so angry about his sudden reappearance that I'd thrown the letter away without reading it completely. But I'd kept the business card, though I wasn't sure why. Looking at that card with its elegant logo and expensive paper stock, I realized that David had apparently made something of himself in the years since he'd walked out on us. The company name suggested some kind of technology business, and the design spoke of success and sophistication. For the first time, I wondered what had become of the man who'd fathered my son and then disappeared. The idea that came to me was both terrifying and exhilarating. If Marcus was so impressed by wealth and status, if he was willing to abandon his own mother for access to Jessica's privileged world, then perhaps it was time he learned about the other half of his genetic heritage. Maybe meeting his biological father would give him some perspective on what really mattered in life. I spent 3 days staring at that business card before I finally worked up the courage to make the call. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, and I almost hung up several times before someone answered. David's assistant was polite but professional, asking for my name and the nature of my business. When I said I was calling about a personal matter regarding David's son Marcus, she put me through immediately. David's voice on the phone was deeper than I remembered, roughened by age and perhaps cigarettes, but I recognized it instantly. He sounded genuinely shocked to hear from me, and when I explained about Marcus's wedding and my exclusion from it, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. He told me he'd been following Marcus's life from a distance for years, using social media and mutual acquaintances to keep track of his son's progress. He knew about the engagement and had been wondering if Marcus would ever want to meet him. The irony of Marcus excluding his mother while planning to marry into a wealthy family wasn't lost on David, who seemed to understand the implications immediately. That's when David revealed something that completely changed the dynamics of our situation. His technology company had been acquired by a major corporation the previous year for an amount that made my head spin. David was now worth more money than I could even comprehend, somewhere in the hundreds of millions of dollars. More importantly, for our purposes, he owned several luxury properties, including a resort in the Bahamas. As we talked, a plan began to form that was both perfectly legal and deliciously ironic. David's resort was one of the most exclusive properties in the Caribbean, exactly the kind of place where wealthy people went to see and be seen. If Marcus and Jessica were planning a destination wedding in the Bahamas, there was a good chance they'd chosen David's resort without ever knowing the connection. David confirmed my suspicions within minutes. He looked up their reservation and found that Marcus and Jessica had indeed booked their wedding at his resort, paying top dollar for the privilege of using one of the most prestigious venues in the Caribbean. They'd specifically requested the premium package, which included personal attention from the resort owner for VIP guests. The irony was so perfect it almost seemed like destiny. Marcus had excluded his working-class mother from his wedding to maintain the sophisticated image Jessica demanded, but he'd unknowingly chosen a venue owned by the father who'd abandoned him. If my son was so impressed by wealth and status, he was about to get a master class in both from someone with a very personal interest in his character. David assured me that he wouldn't do anything to ruin the actual wedding ceremony. Despite our personal feelings, that was still a sacred moment that deserved respect. But the reception was fair game, especially since Marcus himself had requested the VIP treatment that would bring him into contact with the resort owner. If my son wanted to impress his new wife with exclusive connections, he was about to get more than he'd bargained for. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. David would make his usual rounds during the wedding weekend, greeting VIP guests and ensuring their satisfaction with the resort services. If Marcus happened to strike up a conversation with the wealthy resort owner, that would be a natural development that could lead in any number of directions. Whether David chose to reveal his identity would depend on how the interaction unfolded. We spent hours on the phone over the following days, working out the details and discussing possible scenarios. David had done his research on Jessica's family and was amused to discover that their wealth was modest compared to his own empire. Her father's company was successful within their local market, but it was a small operation compared to the international business David had built and sold. More importantly, David had looked into Jessica herself and wasn't impressed by what he'd found. Her social media presence revealed someone obsessed with status and appearances, constantly posting about luxury purchases and exclusive events. She seemed to view relationships as networking opportunities and treated people differently based on their perceived social value. It was exactly the kind of shallow materialism that would appeal to someone trying to escape their humble origins. The week before the wedding, David flew to the Bahamas to prepare for the encounter. He sent me photos of the resort, and it was even more stunning than I'd imagined. Crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, luxury accommodations that cost more per night than I made in a month. Marcus and Jessica had certainly chosen an impressive venue for their celebration, though they had no idea they were enriching the father who'd abandoned their family. David positioned himself strategically throughout the property, familiarizing himself with the wedding timeline and making sure he'd be available when Marcus and Jessica arrived. He dressed carefully for the role, wearing expensive but understated clothing that would signal wealth to those who knew how to recognize the signs. The goal was to seem approachable, but clearly successful, the kind of person who would naturally attract Marcus's attention and admiration. Meanwhile, I was struggling with increasingly complex emotions as the wedding day approached. Part of me was excited about the possibility of Marcus finally meeting his father and gaining some perspective on his recent behavior, but another part of me was terrified that this plan would backfire and drive my son even further away from me. There was also the lingering pain of exclusion, knowing that I should have been there to witness this milestone in Marcus's life. The night before the wedding, David called with a final update. Marcus and Jessica had arrived with their wedding party, and he'd observed them from a distance during the welcome dinner. Marcus looked handsome and confident, clearly in his element among Jessica's sophisticated friends and family. Jessica, meanwhile, was in full bridezilla mode, making demands of the staff and finding fault with various details, despite the resort's impeccable service. David had positioned himself to have breakfast at the resort's main restaurant the next morning, knowing that the wedding party would likely be there as well. He'd prepared conversation starters that would allow him to naturally engage with Marcus if the opportunity arose. The key was to seem genuinely interested in the young couple rather than pushy or intrusive. The morning of the wedding, I could barely sit still. I kept checking my phone for updates from David, but also dreading what I might hear. The idea that my son was celebrating the most important day of his life without me still felt surreal and painful. I tried to distract myself with household chores and television, but my mind kept wandering to that Caribbean resort where my entire family was gathered without my knowledge. Around 10 a.m., my phone finally rang with the call I'd been waiting for. David's voice was strange when he answered, carrying a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and something else I couldn't quite identify. He told me that the plan had worked better than we'd ever anticipated, but that the reality of meeting his son had been more emotionally intense than he'd expected. Marcus had indeed noticed David at breakfast, mainly because Jessica had been making a scene about some minor issue with their table service. David had quietly stepped in to resolve the problem with a few words to the staff, demonstrating the kind of influence that only comes with serious wealth and authority. When the issue was immediately fixed with an efficiency that impressed even Jessica, Marcus had approached David to thank him for his intervention. David described how Marcus had been clearly awed when he introduced himself as the resort owner. The young man David remembered as a toddler was now an adult, but he still had that same eager expression when meeting someone he wanted to impress. Marcus had immediately launched into conversation, asking about the resort business and mentioning his own career in marketing with the enthusiasm of someone hoping to make a professional connection. What struck David most was how much Marcus seemed to crave approval from successful older men. It was obvious that he was still searching for the father figure who'd been absent from his life, though he didn't consciously realize that's what he was doing. The conversation flowed easily, with Marcus asking intelligent questions about business, and David finding himself genuinely impressed by his son's ambition and intelligence. As they talked, David had skillfully guided the conversation toward family and personal background. Marcus had mentioned growing up with a single mother who'd worked hard to support him, but he downplayed the extent of my sacrifices and struggles. He'd made our life sound like a typical middle-class upbringing, rather than the financial hardship and constant worry it had actually been. When David asked about Marcus's father, our son had given the standard lie he'd been telling for years. He said his father had died when he was young, which was easier than explaining abandonment and rejection. David had nodded sympathetically while processing the pain of hearing his own son deny his existence. It was a moment that revealed how completely Marcus had written his father out of his personal narrative. The conversation had been interrupted when Jessica approached, clearly eager to ingratiate herself with the wealthy resort owner she'd just discovered. David described her transformation as almost comical. The demanding bridezilla instantly became charming and deferential when she realized she was talking to someone with real power and influence. Jessica had immediately begun name-dropping and trying to impress David with stories about her family's success and social connections. She mentioned her father's company and her mother's boutique as if they were major enterprises, clearly hoping to establish herself as someone from David's social class. She'd even hinted about their wedding being featured in some society magazine, as if that would cement their importance in his eyes. David had listened politely while internally noting the significant gap between Jessica's pretensions and the reality of her family's modest success. Her father's business was respectable but small. Her mother's boutique was nice, but hardly the high society establishment Jessica was implying. More concerning was the way Jessica spoke about Marcus's background, subtly distancing herself from his working-class origins and making it clear that she considered herself to be marrying beneath her station. The most revealing moment had come when Jessica mentioned how grateful she was that Marcus had evolved beyond his humble beginnings. She'd actually used that word, evolved, as if growing up poor was some kind of developmental phase that successful people naturally outgrew. The casual cruelty of that comment, delivered in front of the son who'd supposedly evolved, told David everything he needed to know about Jessica's character. As the morning progressed, David found himself genuinely liking Marcus, while growing increasingly concerned about Jessica's influence on him. It was obvious that she'd been working systematically to reshape Marcus's identity, encouraging him to be ashamed of his past and focus entirely on climbing social and economic ladders. The fact that Marcus had excluded his own mother from the wedding was clearly part of this transformation Jessica was orchestrating. Around noon, David had made his crucial move. He'd asked Marcus about the wedding ceremony and expressed polite interest in the evening's celebration. Marcus had been thrilled by the attention from such a successful and sophisticated man, clearly seeing this as validation of his new social status. In his excitement, he'd impulsively invited David to attend the reception as an honored guest. Jessica had been even more enthusiastic about David's potential attendance, practically glowing at the prospect of having the resort owner at their wedding reception. She'd clearly seen this as the ultimate seal of approval for their sophisticated celebration, proof that they'd achieved the social status she'd been working toward. The irony that she was inviting her new husband's estranged father to their wedding was lost on both of them. David had accepted the invitation graciously, mentioning that he rarely attended events at his own resort, but that Marcus and Jessica seemed like such an exceptional young couple. He'd promised to stop by the reception to toast their happiness, sending Jessica into a frenzy of excitement about having such a distinguished guest at their celebration. The rest of David's morning update was devoted to finalizing the details of our plan. The reception was scheduled for 7 p.m. on the resort's main terrace overlooking the ocean, with dinner service followed by dancing and traditional wedding toasts. David would make his appearance around 8:30 after the meal, but during the speech-making portion of the evening. That timing would provide the perfect opportunity for dramatic revelations. David assured me once again that he had no intention of ruining Marcus's actual wedding ceremony. Regardless of our personal feelings about his choices, the marriage itself deserved to be treated with respect. But the reception was a different matter entirely, especially since Marcus himself had issued the invitation. If my son wanted to impress his new wife with wealthy connections and social status, he was about to discover that he already had access to more wealth than he'd ever imagined. The hours between David's call and the reception felt endless. I tried to distract myself with every possible activity, but my mind kept wandering to that resort terrace where my son was celebrating the most important day of his life without me. I imagined him in his wedding tuxedo, looking handsome and confident, surrounded by Jessica's family and friends, who'd all agreed that his own mother didn't belong there. At the same time, I was wrestling with complicated emotions about what was about to unfold. Part of me was excited about the possibility of Marcus finally learning some important truths about family, loyalty, and the people who truly matter in life. But another part of me worried that this confrontation might damage our relationship beyond repair, driving him even further away just when I hoped to win him back. At 8 p.m., David called to give me a final update before making his entrance at the reception. His voice was tense with anticipation and nervous energy, as he prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his life. He'd changed into an expensive suit and had arranged for a bottle of the resort's finest champagne to be delivered to the wedding party's table, a gesture that would establish his wealth and generosity while setting up the perfect moment for his toast. I sat in my living room, thousands of miles away from the action, clutching my phone and trying to imagine what was about to happen. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. When David finally called back, his voice was shaking with emotion and barely controlled excitement. He told me that everything had unfolded exactly as we'd planned, but that the reality had been far more intense and emotionally charged than either of us had anticipated. When David approached the wedding party's table with the champagne, Marcus had jumped up to introduce him to everyone as the distinguished resort owner who'd been so kind to them throughout their stay. Jessica had been practically incandescent with pride at having such an important guest at their reception. She'd immediately begun introducing David to her parents and other family members, clearly basking in the reflected glory of his attention. Her father had been impressed by David's obvious wealth and success, while her mother had been charmed by his sophisticated manner and expensive clothes. David had played his role perfectly, making polite conversation with Jessica's family and asking all the appropriate questions about how the couple had met and what their future plans were. Marcus had been animated and confident throughout these interactions, clearly enjoying the validation of having such a successful man show interest in their celebration. The other wedding guests had been equally impressed by David's presence, whispering among themselves about the resort owner who decided to personally attend their reception. Jessica's friends had been taking photos and posting them to social media, clearly excited about the social cash of having such a distinguished guest at their event. When the time came for toasts and speeches, David had requested permission to say a few words as their host. Marcus had been absolutely delighted by the request, while Jessica had been practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of having the resort owner speak at their wedding. The entire reception had fallen silent as David stood with his champagne glass raised. David had begun with all the traditional pleasantries about wishing the couple happiness and success in their marriage. He'd complimented the beautiful ceremony and the lovely setting, drawing murmurs of agreement from the assembled guests. His delivery was smooth and professional, exactly what everyone expected from a successful businessman addressing a wedding reception. But then David's tone had shifted, becoming more personal and emotionally charged. He talked about the importance of family bonds and the connections that link us across time and distance. He'd mentioned how meaningful it was to witness young love and new beginnings, especially when they reminded him of his own past mistakes and missed opportunities. Marcus had been smiling and nodding throughout this portion of the speech, completely unaware of where David was heading with his remarks. Jessica had been beaming with pride, clearly thinking that this distinguished speech was the perfect capstone to their sophisticated celebration. The other guests had been listening attentively, expecting some wise words about marriage and commitment. Then David had dropped the bombshell that changed everything. He'd said that he was particularly moved by this wedding because the groom reminded him so powerfully of himself at that age. In fact, he'd continued, the resemblance was so strong because Marcus was actually his son, the child he'd abandoned 28 years ago and had been searching for ever since. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. David described how Marcus's face had gone through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally shock. Jessica had gone completely pale, her mouth hanging open as she processed the implications of what she'd just heard. The other guests had been whispering and staring, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Marcus had stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before finally finding his voice. He'd demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke, his voice cracking with emotion and disbelief. David had calmly pulled out his phone and shown Marcus a series of photographs, pictures of him holding Marcus as a baby, family photos from before he'd left, legal documents that proved their relationship. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the entire reception. Jessica's parents had looked mortified, suddenly realizing that their new son-in-law had been lying about his father's death for their entire relationship. Other guests had been pulling out their phones, some probably already posting about the unfolding drama on social media. The perfect society wedding Jessica had planned was rapidly transforming into a public spectacle, but the most dramatic reaction had come from Jessica herself. Once the initial shock wore off, she turned on Marcus with a fury that surprised everyone present. She'd accused him of lying to her about his family background, of deceiving her about his fundamental identity. The fact that his father was obviously wealthy should have been good news, but Jessica was focused entirely on the deception rather than the potential financial benefits. Marcus had tried desperately to explain that he genuinely believed his father was dead, that he'd been protecting himself from the pain of abandonment rather than trying to deceive anyone. But Jessica wasn't interested in his explanations or excuses. She was humiliated that her carefully planned wedding had become a soap opera, and she blamed Marcus entirely for bringing this chaos into what should have been their perfect day. The argument between Marcus and Jessica escalated quickly, with their raised voices carrying across the previously elegant reception. Jessica accused Marcus of being immature and fundamentally dishonest, while Marcus defended himself and tried to process the shock of meeting his father after 28 years. David had attempted to intervene and calm the situation, but Jessica had turned her anger on him as well, accusing him of deliberately sabotaging their wedding with his dramatic revelation. That's when Jessica made the comment that changed everything and revealed her true character. In her fury and humiliation, she shouted that this was exactly the kind of trashy drama she'd expected from Marcus's side of the family. She'd said she should have known better than to marry someone from such a dysfunctional background, and that she was finally understanding why Marcus's mother wasn't fit to attend a respectable wedding. The mention of me had triggered something in Marcus that David described as genuinely frightening. All the color had drained from his face, and he'd gone very still in a way that suggested he was finally understanding the full magnitude of what he'd done. For the first time, he was seeing Jessica's true attitude toward his family and background, and it was uglier than he'd ever imagined. Marcus had quietly asked Jessica what exactly she meant about his mother not being fit for their wedding. Jessica, still caught up in her anger and no longer filtering her words, had said far more than she'd probably intended. She'd admitted that she'd pressured Marcus to exclude me from the wedding because she didn't want some working-class nurse embarrassing them in front of her family and friends. She'd gone on to describe me in terms that were both classist and cruel, suggesting that people like me didn't understand how to behave in sophisticated social settings. She'd made it clear that she viewed my presence as a liability that could have damaged their social standing and reflected poorly on her family's reputation. The honesty was brutal, but it was exactly what Marcus needed to hear. David said that watching his son's face during Jessica's rant was like watching someone wake up from a long, pleasant dream only to discover they were living in a nightmare. Marcus was finally seeing his new wife's true character, and it was nothing like the refined, sophisticated woman he thought he'd married. The mask had completely fallen away, revealing someone whose love was entirely conditional on social status and financial advantage. The reception had essentially collapsed at that point. Jessica's parents had tried desperately to salvage the situation by suggesting everyone move to the bar area and allow the couple to work through their differences privately. But the damage was irreversible, and most guests had begun making their excuses and departing. The fairy tale wedding Jessica had spent months planning was ending in complete disaster. David had remained as the crowd dispersed, finally getting the opportunity for a private conversation with Marcus that he'd been hoping for since the day he'd walked out on us. He described their talk as painful but absolutely necessary, with Marcus asking all the questions that had been building up inside him for 28 years of wondering about his absent father. Marcus had wanted to know why David had left in the first place, where he'd been all these years, and why he'd never tried to make contact before now. David had answered with complete honesty, admitting his failures as a young man and explaining how success and maturity had given him the perspective to realize what he'd lost when he abandoned his family. David had also made it clear that I had never spoken badly about him, despite having every right to poison Marcus against the father who'd abandoned us. He'd described my years of sacrifice and struggle, painting a picture of a mother who had given everything for her son, only to be discarded when he no longer needed her financial support and emotional guidance. The conversation had gradually turned to my exclusion from the wedding, and David had described my devastation at being rejected by the son I'd raised alone. He'd explained how I'd worked double shifts to pay for Marcus's education, how I'd gone without necessities to ensure he had everything he needed, and how I'd always put his happiness ahead of my own comfort and security. By the end of their conversation, Marcus had been crying openly, finally understanding the full scope of his betrayal. He'd realized that Jessica had systematically manipulated him into abandoning the one person who had always been there for him, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him the opportunities that led to his current success. Marcus had also begun to see that his new wife's love was entirely transactional, based on his ability to provide the lifestyle and social status she craved, rather than any genuine affection for who he was as a person. The revelation about David's wealth should have been cause for celebration, but Jessica had been more focused on the embarrassment of public drama than the potential financial benefits. David's final update from that evening came around midnight. Marcus had returned to their honeymoon suite to find Jessica packing her bags with grim determination. She'd announced that she was flying back to the mainland immediately and needed time to think about whether their marriage could survive what had happened at the reception. Jessica had made it brutally clear that she'd married Marcus based on certain expectations about their future together. Finding out that he'd been dishonest about his family background, regardless of the circumstances or his own ignorance, had fundamentally undermined her trust in him as a partner and provider. More importantly, the public drama and chaos of the evening had revealed that Marcus came with complications she hadn't signed up for when she'd agreed to marry him. She'd expected a smooth transition into a more sophisticated lifestyle, not the kind of family drama that would follow them for years and potentially damage her own social standing. The irony was absolutely devastating. Marcus had abandoned his mother to please a woman who ultimately didn't want him anyway. He'd sacrificed the one relationship in his life that was truly unconditional for a marriage that couldn't survive its first real test of character and loyalty. Jessica had been particularly brutal in explaining her decision to leave. She'd said that the entire evening had shown her what their married life would really be like. Dealing with his family drama, managing the complications of his working-class background, and constantly worrying about how his relatives might embarrass her in social situations. She'd married Marcus expecting to move up in the world, to gain access to a more refined and sophisticated lifestyle. Instead, she discovered that he came with exactly the kind of baggage she'd been trying to escape from her own modest, middle-class origins. The wedding night that should have been the beginning of their new life together had instead revealed the fundamental incompatibility of their values and expectations. Marcus had begged Jessica to stay and work through their problems, but she'd been completely done with their relationship. She'd made it clear that trust, once broken, couldn't be easily repaired, and that she needed a partner who could provide stability rather than chaos and complications. David had stayed with Marcus through the worst of his emotional breakdown, providing the paternal comfort and guidance that had been missing from his life for so long. They'd talked until sunrise, with Marcus sharing stories about his childhood, and David filling in the gaps about his own journey from irresponsible young man to successful businessman. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much time had passed, and too much damage had been done for that kind of instant healing. But it was definitely a beginning. The first honest conversation between father and son in nearly 3 decades. David had been impressed by the man Marcus had become, while also recognizing the insecurity and need for approval that had made him vulnerable to Jessica's manipulation. As the sun rose over the resort, Marcus had asked David for my phone number. He'd wanted to call immediately and apologize for everything he'd done, but David had wisely suggested that he wait until he returned home and could see me in person. Some conversations were too important for phone calls, and Marcus needed to face the full reality of his actions before he could begin to make amends. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls between David and me as we processed everything that had happened. Marcus had returned from what should have been his honeymoon completely alone, with Jessica remaining in the Bahamas for another week to think about their future. The society wedding that was supposed to launch their new life together had instead ended their marriage before it had really begun. I spent those days wrestling with my own complex emotions about everything that had unfolded. Part of me felt vindicated that Marcus had finally seen Jessica's true character and understood the price of abandoning family for social status. But another part of me was heartbroken for my son, who'd had his dreams shattered so publicly and painfully. There was also the question of David's role in our lives going forward. After 28 years of absence, he was suddenly back with obvious wealth and a genuine desire to reconnect with the family he'd abandoned. I wasn't sure how I felt about his reappearance, or whether Marcus and I were ready to navigate the complicated dynamics of rebuilding relationships that had been broken for so long. Marcus finally came to see me 4 days after returning from the Bahamas. I'd been incredibly nervous about our reunion, unsure how to handle the mixture of anger, relief, hurt, and lingering love that had been churning inside me since his wedding day. When I opened my front door and saw him standing there with tears streaming down his face, 28 years of motherhood kicked in automatically. I found myself holding him while he sobbed like the little boy he'd once been, apologizing over and over again for everything he'd said and done. His breakdown was complete and heartbreaking, the emotional release of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of their mistakes and the price of their choices. His apology was comprehensive and devastatingly honest. Marcus acknowledged every cruel thing he'd said to me, taking full responsibility for choosing Jessica's approval over my feelings and well-being. He admitted that he'd been ashamed of our modest background and had allowed that shame to poison his judgment and damage our relationship. Most importantly, Marcus recognized that I had been the one constant source of love and support in his life, and that he'd thrown it away for a fantasy of social acceptance that had ultimately proven to be hollow and meaningless. He understood now that Jessica had never really loved him for who he was, but had seen him as a project to be improved and molded into someone more suitable for her social aspirations. We talked for hours that first day, working through years of accumulated pain, misunderstanding, and resentment. Marcus told me about the pressure he'd felt to succeed and fit in with Jessica's crowd, and how that pressure had gradually eroded his connection to his roots and his appreciation for the sacrifices I'd made. He genuinely believed that distancing himself from his past was necessary for his future success, not realizing that he was destroying the very foundation that had made his achievements possible. The working-class values I'd instilled in him, hard work, loyalty, family commitment, were actually his greatest strengths, not weaknesses to be overcome. I shared my own hurt and disappointment about his behavior, but also my relief that he'd finally seen Jessica for who she really was. A woman who couldn't accept and embrace his family would never have made him truly happy, even if their marriage had survived. Sometimes the most painful losses turn out to be unexpected blessings in disguise. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly to rebuild our relationship while also dealing with the legal and social aftermath of his failed marriage. Jessica had filed for annulment rather than divorce, claiming fraud based on Marcus's supposed misrepresentation of his family background. The legal proceedings were messy and very public, providing plenty of gossip for their former social circle. The most satisfying part of the whole ordeal was watching Jessica's reaction when she learned the full extent of David's wealth. Once word got out that Marcus's father was actually worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Jessica had tried desperately to reconcile with Marcus, claiming that her departure from their honeymoon had been a misunderstanding born of shock and confusion. But Marcus had seen enough of her character during their wedding reception to know that her love was entirely transactional. Her sudden interest in reconciliation, which coincided perfectly with her discovery of David's fortune, only confirmed what he'd already learned about her priorities and values. Jessica had actually shown up at Marcus's apartment one evening, dressed to kill and armed, with explanations for her behavior that painted her as the injured party. She claimed that she'd been overwhelmed by the drama of meeting David and had needed space to process the implications for their future together. Marcus had listened politely to her carefully rehearsed speech, but when she was finished, he'd simply told her that he finally understood what kind of person she really was. The woman who'd convinced him to exclude his own mother from their wedding because she didn't fit the right social profile was not someone he could trust with his heart or his future. The rejection had sent Jessica into a rage that revealed even more of her true character. She'd screamed at Marcus about throwing away their future together, about being too stupid to appreciate what she'd offered him, and about never finding anyone else who would work as hard to improve him as she had. That last comment had been particularly telling, confirming that Jessica had always seen Marcus as a fixer-upper project rather than a man she loved for who he already was. Her version of love required him to constantly prove himself worthy of her attention, to earn her affection through social and financial achievements, rather than simply being accepted for his authentic self. David had been spending increasing amounts of time with both of us as we all worked to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of absence, misunderstanding, and hurt feelings. It was awkward at first, with old resentments and unresolved emotions bubbling up regularly, but there was genuine affection beneath all the complications. Marcus was getting to know his father as an adult, learning about David's journey from irresponsible young man to successful businessman, while also sharing his own experiences of growing up without paternal guidance. They had a lot of lost time to make up for, but both men seemed committed to building something real and lasting. My own relationship with David was perhaps the most complex of all. I couldn't simply forget 28 years of abandonment and single parenthood, but I also couldn't ignore the genuine remorse he showed or the effort he was making to reconnect with his family. We were taking things very slowly, focusing on our shared love for Marcus rather than trying to rebuild a romantic relationship that had ended decades ago. The three of us had dinner together for the first time 2 months after the wedding disaster, an event that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. We spent the evening sharing stories and memories, filling in the gaps in our family history, and beginning to create new traditions that included all of us. Marcus asked me during that dinner if I regretted the way everything had unfolded with Jessica and the wedding. It was a question I'd been thinking about constantly, and my answer surprised even me. I told him that while I wouldn't have chosen for him to experience that kind of pain and public humiliation, I was grateful that he'd learned these crucial lessons about love, loyalty, and family before it was too late. Some people need to touch the fire before they understand that it burns, and Marcus had needed to experience conditional love before he could appreciate the unconditional variety. Jessica's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also opened his eyes to truths about relationships and values that might have taken him years to discover otherwise. The son who came back to me after his failed wedding was fundamentally different from the one who'd excluded me from the celebration. He was wiser, more grounded, and much more appreciative of the relationships that had sustained him throughout his life. The experience had stripped away his illusions about social status and forced him to confront what really mattered. Marcus had also gained something he'd never had before, a relationship with his father. David's reappearance in our lives had been complicated and sometimes painful, but it had also provided closure and healing that none of us had expected. The family that emerged from the wreckage of that disastrous wedding was more honest and authentic than anything we'd had before. 3 months after the wedding, Marcus came to me with news that Jessica had gotten engaged to someone else, a man whose family background she'd thoroughly investigated in advance to avoid any unpleasant surprises. I heard through mutual friends that she'd learned from her experience with Marcus and was now dating someone whose pedigree was completely transparent and socially acceptable. I found myself feeling genuinely sorry for Jessica's new fiancé, whoever he was. Any man who had to pass family background checks and social status requirements before being deemed worthy of love was probably in for a lifetime of conditional affection and constant evaluation. Jessica would likely spend their entire relationship looking for someone better, more successful, or more socially advantageous. Marcus, meanwhile, had sworn off dating entirely for the time being. He said he needed to figure out who he really was and what he actually wanted from life before he could offer himself to another person. The experience with Jessica had shown him how easily he could be manipulated when he was desperate for approval and acceptance. David had been incredibly supportive during Marcus's period of self-reflection, sharing his own stories about the mistakes he'd made in relationships and the lessons he'd learned about authentic connection versus surface attraction. Having a father figure to guide him through this difficult time was something Marcus had never experienced before, and it was clearly making a difference in his emotional development. The legal proceedings from the annulment had finally been resolved, with Jessica receiving a modest settlement that covered her wedding expenses but nothing more. She tried to claim damages for emotional distress and public humiliation, but the court had ruled that Marcus's ignorance about his father's identity didn't constitute fraud or misrepresentation. The whole legal mess had been extensively covered in the local society pages, providing entertainment for people who enjoyed reading about the dramatic downfall of social climbers. Jessica's reputation in her former social circle had been significantly damaged, while Marcus had gained a certain amount of sympathy as the victim of manipulation and social pressure. 6 months after the wedding, David surprised both Marcus and me by announcing that he was selling his resort business and planning to move back to our area permanently. He said that reconnecting with his family had reminded him what was truly important in life, and that he wanted to spend his remaining years building the relationships he'd neglected for so long. The decision meant that David would be a regular presence in our lives, rather than an occasional visitor, which brought up new questions about how our family dynamic would evolve. Marcus was thrilled at the prospect of having his father nearby, while I was still processing my own feelings about David's permanent return to our community. We decided to take things one day at a time, focusing on building trust and understanding rather than trying to recreate relationships that had been destroyed decades ago. The three of us were essentially starting from scratch, learning to be a family in ways we'd never experienced before. Marcus had started therapy to work through his issues with abandonment, approval-seeking, and social insecurity. The experience with Jessica had revealed patterns of behavior and thinking that were holding him back from authentic relationships and genuine happiness. He was determined to do the internal work necessary to become the kind of man who could attract and maintain healthy relationships. The therapist had helped Marcus understand how his father's abandonment had created a desperate need for male approval that made him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who offered the status and acceptance he craved. Jessica had recognized this vulnerability and exploited it for her own purposes, gradually isolating him from his support system while reshaping his identity to suit her preferences. Understanding these patterns was the first step toward breaking them. Marcus was learning to value his own judgment over external validation, to appreciate his authentic self rather than constantly trying to become someone else's ideal partner. It was difficult work, but he was committed to becoming emotionally healthy before entering another serious relationship. David had also started therapy to work through his own guilt and regret about abandoning his family. He was dealing with decades of shame about his failures as a husband and father, while also trying to figure out how to rebuild relationships he destroyed through his own selfishness and immaturity. The three of us had begun attending family therapy sessions together, working through our shared history and learning to communicate more effectively about our needs, expectations, and boundaries. It was sometimes painful to revisit old wounds, but it was also healing to finally address issues that had been festering for years. 1 year after the wedding disaster, Marcus threw a small dinner party to celebrate what he called his Independence Day, the anniversary of discovering Jessica's true character and choosing family over social status. He invited David and me, along with a few close friends who had supported him through his divorce and recovery. During the dinner, Marcus gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. He said that the worst day of his life had ultimately become the catalyst for the best year of his life. Losing Jessica had been painful, but gaining authentic relationships with both his parents had been worth every moment of suffering and humiliation. He thanked me for never giving up on him, even when he'd given me every reason to walk away. He thanked David for having the courage to reveal himself and force a confrontation that led to growth and healing. Most importantly, he thanked both of us for showing him what unconditional love looked like, so he'd know what to look for in future relationships. The wedding that was supposed to exclude me had ended up bringing our family together in ways I never could have imagined. Sometimes the most painful betrayals lead to the most important revelations and the strongest eventual bonds. Marcus had learned that you can't build a future by running from your past, and that the people who love you at your worst are the ones worth keeping. As I looked around that dinner table at my son and his father, both of them working so hard to become better men and build authentic relationships, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. We weren't a perfect family, and we probably never would be. But we were real in a way that post photographs and social media posts could never capture. The house that had once felt empty with just me in it was now regularly filled with laughter, conversation, and the kind of messy authenticity that comes from people who've seen each other's worst moments and chosen to love anyway. Marcus had learned the difference between conditional and unconditional love. David had learned that success without family is hollow, and I had learned that sometimes the biggest losses lead to the greatest gains. A year and a half after the wedding, Marcus started dating again, but this time with completely different criteria. Instead of looking for someone who could elevate his social status, he was seeking a partner who shared his values and could appreciate his authentic self. The difference in his approach was remarkable, and it gave me hope that he truly learned from his painful experience with Jessica. The woman he eventually introduced to David and me was nothing like Jessica. Sarah was an elementary school teacher from a working-class background similar to our own. She was warm, genuine, and completely unimpressed by material wealth or social status. When Marcus told her about his father's success, she was happy for their family but clearly more interested in David as a person than as a wealthy businessman. Most importantly, Sarah loved hearing stories about Marcus's childhood and our family history. She asked questions about my work as a nurse, wanted to see photo albums from Marcus's youth, and treated our modest family traditions with respect and curiosity. She understood that Marcus's character had been shaped by our shared struggles, and she valued those experiences rather than seeing them as embarrassments to overcome. The contrast with Jessica couldn't have been more stark. Where Jessica had wanted to erase Marcus's past, Sarah embraced it. Where Jessica had seen his working-class background as a liability, Sarah saw it as evidence of his resilience and strong values. Where Jessica had tried to isolate him from his family, Sarah actively encouraged his relationships with David and me. Watching Marcus with Sarah showed me just how much he'd grown and changed since his disaster of a wedding. He was more confident in his own skin, less desperate for external validation, and much better at recognizing genuine affection versus manipulation. The painful lessons he'd learned from Jessica had made him wiser and more emotionally mature. David had also found love again, though his situation was quite different from Marcus's. He'd met Elena, a widow in her 50s who ran a small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping single mothers complete their education. She knew about David's wealth but was completely unimpressed by it, having seen too many wealthy people who lacked compassion and genuine human connection. Elena's reaction to our family story was beautiful. She praised me for my sacrifices and strength, welcomed David's efforts to make amends for his past mistakes, and celebrated Marcus's growth and wisdom. She understood that real family bonds are forged through shared struggles and mutual support, not inherited wealth or social status. The 4 adults in our expanded family, Marcus, Sarah, David, and Elena, got along wonderfully, sharing similar values about what really mattered in life. Our family gatherings became celebrations of authenticity, resilience, and the power of second chances. We'd all learned that love worth having doesn't require you to become someone else. 2 years after his failed wedding, Marcus proposed to Sarah in the most beautiful way possible. Instead of some elaborate display designed to impress others, he proposed during a quiet family dinner at my house, surrounded by the people who'd supported them both through their individual journeys toward emotional health and authentic love. Sarah said yes immediately, and when they started planning their wedding, the contrast with Marcus's previous experience was remarkable. They chose a simple ceremony at a local church, followed by a reception in the community center where Marcus had played basketball as a teenager. The guest list included family, close friends, and the people who'd been there for them during difficult times. Most importantly, Sarah insisted that I play a central role in their wedding celebration, She asked me to help her get ready on the morning of the ceremony, requested that I give a reading during the service, and made sure I was seated in the front row with David and Elena. She understood that honoring family meant including the people who'd actually been there through the hard times. The wedding was everything Marcus's first celebration should have been but wasn't. It was authentic, meaningful, and focused on the actual commitment being made rather than the social impression being created. The guests were there because they genuinely cared about the couple, not because they were obligated to attend or needed to be impressed. During his wedding toast, Marcus talked about how grateful he was for his failed first marriage, because it had taught him the difference between love that demands you change and love that helps you become your best authentic self. He said that losing Jessica had been devastating at the time, but necessary for him to grow into the kind of man who deserved someone like Sarah. He also thanked David and me for showing him that real family doesn't abandon you when you make mistakes, but works with you to learn and grow from them. He said that having both his parents at his wedding, really present and engaged, not just physically there, was worth more than any expensive destination celebration could ever be. As I watched my son dance with his new wife at their reception, I reflected on the incredible journey we'd all taken over the past few years. The wedding that was supposed to exclude me had ultimately led to the most authentic and meaningful family relationships any of us had ever experienced. Marcus had learned that you can't buy love, respect, or genuine happiness through social climbing or material success. David had learned that walking away from responsibility doesn't solve problems. It just creates bigger ones that have to be faced eventually. And I had learned that sometimes the most painful losses are actually disguised gifts that lead to something better than we ever imagined possible. The son who had once been ashamed of his working-class mother was now proud to introduce me as the woman who'd raised him alone and taught him everything that mattered. The father who had once run away from family responsibility was now eager to be involved in every aspect of our lives. And the mother who had once been excluded from her son's wedding was now surrounded by a family that valued authenticity over appearance. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything about how our story unfolded. The pain was necessary for the growth, the loss was required for the gain, and the betrayal was the catalyst for the deeper understanding that followed. Sometimes life has to break us down before it can build us back up into something stronger and more genuine. The wedding that banned me from attending had ultimately given me the most precious gift imaginable, a real relationship with my son based on mutual respect, authentic love, and shared values rather than obligation and guilt. And that was worth more than any fancy Caribbean celebration could ever have been.